Hello, my friends. What we are witnessing on the Ukrainian battlefield is not a sudden collapse, nor is it a dramatic breakthrough defined by sweeping armored thrusts or cinematic encirclements. It is something far more methodical, far more Russian, and far more lethal in the long run. A deliberate, system-wide campaign of attrition designed to exhaust Ukraine's manpower, morale, and institutional coherence, while steadily expanding Russian operational freedom across the entire front. The defining feature of the current phase of the war is not speed, but simultaneity. Unlike 2022, or even much of 2023, when combat was concentrated around singular focal points, such as Bakhmut, Avdiivka, or the Zaporizhzhia counteroffensive, Russia is now prosecuting offensive operations along multiple axes at once. This shift is not accidental. It reflects a structural transformation inside the Russian military itself. Russia today is not fighting with isolated formations or elite spearheads. It is operating multiple combined arms armies simultaneously, each capable of independent offensive and defensive action. This matters enormously. Ukraine's defensive doctrine, already strained by manpower shortages, was built around responding to singular threats. That model no longer works when pressure is applied everywhere at once. When Ukrainian forces manage to stabilize one sector, Russian units simply shift momentum elsewhere. When Ukraine pulls a brigade from one area to reinforce another, the vacated sector is immediately exploited. This is not improvisation. It is operational design. The fall of long-held positions illustrates this pattern clearly. Areas that Ukraine relied upon to maintain a cohesive defensive line terrain that had anchored resistance for years are now being abandoned or overrun with startling speed once pressure becomes unsustainable. Cities that once appeared immovable are suddenly exposed, not because of tactical brilliance at a single point, but because the overall Ukrainian defensive system is coming apart. Russia's advances are not spectacular, but they are relentless. Tactical heights west of recently captured urban centers are being seized, supply routes are being degraded, Ukrainian strongpoints are being reduced one by one. Meanwhile, Ukrainian counterattacks, while occasionally successful, remain local, temporary, and strategically irrelevant to the broader trajectory of the war. This disparity exists because Russia now possesses escalation dominance across multiple domains: manpower, artillery, air power, and operational depth. Ukraine does not. A critical but often misunderstood factor behind Russia's improved performance lies in how it reorganized its assault forces after 2023. The dissolution of Wagner was widely misinterpreted in Western commentary as a sign of weakness. In reality, it marked a decentralization of combat experience. Rather than hoarding elite formations, Russia embedded assault battalions, storm units within every brigade. The result was that Russian regiments and divisions became capable of independent offensive action without reliance on specialized formations. There are no longer elite Russian units driving the front forward while others stagnate. Every Russian formation can attack, defend, and maneuver. Ukraine cannot say the same. Compounding this is Russia's overwhelming advantage in air-delivered firepower, particularly through the systematic use of FAB glide bombs. These weapons have reshaped the battlefield. Ukrainian infantry positions, especially tree lines and lightly fortified areas, are simply pulverized before ground contact even occurs. In many cases, Ukrainian defensive positions are reduced to token manning because anything more would be annihilated. This creates infiltration opportunities. Russian forces move not as massive columns, but as dispersed elements: motorcycles, quads, small assault teams slipping through gaps created by firepower dominance. Drones, while dangerous, cannot hold ground. Ukraine's growing reliance on drones reflects desperation, not adaptation. Wars are not won by sensors alone. Terrain must be seized and held by men. Ukraine increasingly lacks those men. The front line itself no longer resembles the defined trench systems of 2022 and early 2023. It has become porous, fragmented, and unstable. Disconnected strongpoints replace continuous lines. Russian reconnaissance and diversionary groups now operate deep behind Ukrainian positions, targeting drone operators and logistics hubs. Once the rear becomes unsafe, the front ceases to exist in any meaningful sense, behind this battlefield erosion lies a far more dangerous problem for Ukraine. Institutional collapse driven by manpower exhaustion, desertion, and corruption. Ukraine is facing a desertion crisis of historic proportions. When prosecutors stop reporting desertion figures, it is not because the problem has been solved, it is because the numbers have become politically intolerable. Reports of tens of thousands of deserters per month, many disappearing during training, indicate a military that cannot retain its own mobilized manpower. This is not simply fear, it is a collapse of trust. Ukrainian society has been hollowed out by corruption so blatant that it destroys any sense of shared sacrifice. Men at the front see elites embezzling funds, fleeing abroad, or living comfortably while preaching patriotism from safety. They see officers buying exemptions. They see borders that money can open. Under such conditions, loyalty disintegrates. Russia, by contrast, does not suffer from this asymmetry. It recruits rather than forcibly mobilizes at scale, drawing tens of thousands of volunteers monthly through financial incentives and contractual obligation. Once enlisted, Russian soldiers remain until war's end, unless wounded. This ensures continuity, cohesion, and institutional memory. Manpower is not just about population size. It is about willingness, legitimacy, and enforceability. Russia has all three. Ukraine increasingly has none. Ukraine's leadership failures compound this structural weakness. Command dysfunction, lack of meritocracy, and political interference have produced an officer corps that rotates incompetence rather than removes it. Brigades fail not because of tactical incompetence alone, but because higher command assigns impossible missions without adequate support, then scapegoats subordinates when collapse follows. Attempts at reform are arriving too late. Ukraine is only now learning operational economy, elastic defense, and targeted counterattacks using elite volunteer units. These adaptations may slow Russian advances in select sectors, but they cannot reverse the strategic balance. Ukraine is no longer fighting to win. It is fighting to make defeat more expensive. That distinction matters. Once a military internalizes inevitable loss, its objectives shift from restoration to punishment. Counterattacks become symbolic. Terrain becomes expendable. Time becomes the only remaining currency. But time favors the side with manpower, industrial depth, and political cohesion. That side is Russia. The illusion that this war can be frozen through negotiation ignores battlefield reality. Wars do not end when one side wishes to stop. They end when one side can no longer continue. Russia has not reached that point. Ukraine is approaching it. From Moscow's perspective, this war is existential, historical, and final. Ceasefires have already failed. Rearmament periods have already been exploited. There is no incentive to pause when momentum is growing and strategic objectives remain achievable. Territory will continue to change hands, not because Russia is racing forward, but because Ukraine is running out of places to stand. And when the final line breaks, it will not do so gradually. Attritional warfare always appears linear until it isn't. Collapse comes suddenly, unexpectedly, and irreversibly. That is where this war is heading. The Kharkiv-Kupiansk Oskil axis and the logic of systemic breakdown. If Part I outlined the strategic landscape of an attritional war increasingly tilted in Russia's favor, Part 2 must focus on the structural fault lines, the areas where Ukraine's exhaustion is no longer theoretical, but visibly inscribed on the map itself. The Kharkiv-Kupiansk-Oskil axis is one such fault line. This region is not merely another sector of the front. It functions as a logistical spine and psychological anchor for Ukraine's entire northeastern defense. Once this axis becomes unstable, attempts to maintain coherence in Donbass or Zaporizhia lose their strategic meaning. Crucially, Russia is not attempting to seize Kharkiv through a dramatic, high-risk offensive. Instead, it is pursuing something far more effective, rendering Kharkiv indefensible. Russian pressure in this sector follows a familiar and deliberate pattern. Rather than seeking rapid penetration, Moscow applies steady, distributed force to dismantle the support structures that allow Ukrainian defenses to function. Kupiansk, once a critical logistical hub reclaimed by Ukraine in 2022, has now become a liability. Every major supply route into the city lies under persistent Russian fire control, artillery, reconnaissance drones, and most decisively, tactical aviation employing glide bombs. When resupply becomes a gamble, defense ceases to be defense. It becomes delay. The Oskol River was long treated as a natural defensive barrier, a geographic line behind which Ukrainian forces could stabilize the front and regroup. That assumption belongs to an earlier era of warfare. Modern firepower does not respect rivers. Russia does not need large-scale river crossings to negate the Oskol's defensive value. It only needs to stretch Ukrainian manpower to the point where both banks cannot be held simultaneously. Under those conditions, the river transforms from shield to trap. The core issue here is not terrain, but force elasticity. Ukraine no longer possesses it. Every brigade shifted to reinforce the Kharkiv axis weakens another sector. Every emergency redeployment plugs one gap by creating another. Russia understands this dynamic and exploits it systematically. At the operational level, initiative has fully inverted. Ukraine no longer chooses where decisive engagement occurs. It reacts. In attritional warfare, the reactive side always loses. Another factor largely ignored in Western commentary is force quality and sustainability. Ukraine's problem is not merely equipment shortages, but the absence of durable, cohesive formations. Newly raised brigades enter combat undertrained, underled, and internally fragile. When these units are committed to high-pressure sectors such as Kupiansk or northern Kharkiv, the outcome is predictably grim. Russia, by contrast, rotates units without destroying institutional continuity. Battalions withdraw and refit, but regiments persist, divisions retain cohesion, and combat experience accumulates rather than resets. This is the difference between an army learning how to win and an army learning how to endure. Localized Ukrainian counterattacks in this region, often amplified in Western media, do not alter the strategic balance. They do not disrupt Russian logistics, negate air superiority, or impose lasting costs. They merely consume what Ukraine can least afford to lose: trained manpower. Seen from a wider angle, the Kharkiv axis reflects a pattern repeated across the theater. Russia does not need rapid victory. It needs only to avoid defeat while maintaining sufficient pressure to force Ukraine into internal military, political, and social exhaustion. This reality raises the question Kiev and its Western patrons consistently evade: what is the end state? Ukraine lacks a plausible military path to victory. Negotiations conducted from weakness are not strategy. They are deferred acknowledgement of loss. Every additional month of war worsens Ukraine's eventual settlement. Russia understands this calculus and therefore has no incentive to rush. Attritional wars do not end with heroic moments. They end when one side loses the structural capacity to function as an organized fighting force. The indicators of that moment, mass desertion, command breakdown, fragmented defensive lines, and rear area insecurity, are already visible on the Ukrainian side. The only remaining uncertainty is not whether collapse will occur, but where and when. History is unambiguous on this point. Once collapse in an attritional war begins, it does not unfold incrementally. It cascades. End states, NATO's strategic dead end, and why Russia does not need to occupy all of Ukraine. By this stage of the war, the most consequential question is no longer tactical or even operational. It is existential and strategic. How does this war end, and on whose terms? The answer becomes clearer once illusions are stripped away and the constraints facing each actor are examined without sentiment. Ukraine does not possess a viable military end state that resembles victory. Regaining lost territory is no longer plausible under current force ratios. Sustaining the war indefinitely is impossible given manpower depletion, institutional fragility, and economic dependence. What remains are not strategies, but scenarios of loss, differentiated only by severity. The least catastrophic outcome for Ukraine would involve a negotiated settlement under conditions of pronounced weakness. Even this scenario entails permanent territorial losses, demilitarization constraints, and political subordination in security matters. Crucially, such negotiations would not occur because diplomacy triumphed, but because Ukraine's capacity to resist collapsed to the point where continuation became meaningless. Worse scenarios follow naturally if political leadership refuses to accept reality. A prolonged war of exhaustion risks triggering a rapid, cascading military breakdown, one in which entire sectors unravel faster than command structures can respond. In that environment, negotiations do not shape outcomes. They ratify fate's accomplice. Western policymakers often cling to the notion that NATO involvement can arrest this trajectory. This belief ignores NATO's structural limitations. Alliance cohesion depends on political consensus among states with vastly different threat perceptions and tolerance for risk. Direct intervention against Russia would require levels of escalation that NATO neither desires nor can sustain without catastrophic consequences. The West toolkit is therefore constrained to arms deliveries, financial support, intelligence sharing, and rhetorical escalation. These instruments can prolong conflict, but they cannot reverse strategic asymmetry. Ukraine remains dependent on external supply chains that Russia is not meaningfully threatened by. Russia's military-industrial base, by contrast, has expanded under wartime conditions, while Ukraine's economy survives on life support. There is also a timing problem the West cannot solve. NATO systems require long training pipelines, maintenance infrastructure, and logistical integration. Russia's advantage lies precisely in the fact that time works in its favor. Every delay degrades Ukraine's force quality faster than Western aid can restore it. This leads to a fundamental misunderstanding in Western analysis. The assumption that Russia must occupy all of Ukraine to win. That assumption is false. Russia's strategic objectives do not require total occupation. They require neutralization. A Ukraine that cannot function as a military platform for NATO, cannot threaten Russian territory, and cannot serve as a geopolitical spear against Moscow satisfies Russia's core goals. Territorial control is a means, not an end. By systematically degrading Ukraine's armed forces, hollowing out its mobilization capacity, and rendering its economy and infrastructure dependent and fragile, Russia can achieve strategic dominance without bearing the enormous costs of full occupation. A truncated, weakened Ukrainian state, politically unstable, economically exhausted, and militarily constrained, is sufficient. This approach also minimizes Russia's long-term burdens. Occupation breeds resistance, drains resources, and complicates governance. Strategic paralysis of an adversary, by contrast, produces compliance through limitation rather than coercion. From Moscow's perspective, this war has already settled into a long-view framework. Russia is not optimizing for headlines or rapid territorial gains. It is optimizing for irreversibility. Each phase of the conflict is designed to eliminate Ukraine's options one by one until no meaningful choices remain. The West faces a similar narrowing of options, though it refuses to acknowledge it. Escalation risks uncontrollable conflict. De-escalation implies acceptance of failure. Stasis only worsens Ukraine's position. None of these paths preserve the original political objectives articulated in 2022. This is why official narratives increasingly substitute symbolism for strategy, declarations of resolve replace achievable goals, aid packages substitute for end states. Public optimism masks private resignation. Wars end when asymmetry becomes undeniable. Not when morale slogans run out, but when institutions fail to perform their basic functions, command, sustainment, and legitimacy. Ukraine is moving toward that threshold. Russia is not. The final phase of this war will not resemble its opening. It will not be dramatic, cinematic, or heroic. It will be administrative, units failing to report, lines dissolving quietly, territory changing hands without battle, because there is no one left to defend it. Collapse in attritional war is never linear. It accelerates, and when it does, the outcome will not be negotiated into existence. It will already exist, waiting only to be acknowledged. The first ending occurs on the battlefield, when one side loses the capacity to impose its will through organized violence. The second ending comes later, when politicians, historians, and institutions finally admit what has already happened. Ukraine's war is moving rapidly toward the first ending, while the West remains trapped in the illusion of postponing the second. This conflict began as a contest of narratives, escalated into a contest of resources, and has now resolved itself into a contest of endurance. On that final metric, the imbalance is decisive. Russia possesses strategic depth, demographic resilience, industrial mobilization, and most critically, a political system willing to absorb the costs of long war. Ukraine does not. No amount of rhetorical solidarity can manufacture those attributes once they are exhausted. The tragedy for Ukraine is not merely military defeat, but strategic misalignment. It was encouraged to fight a war whose objectives exceeded its structural capacity on timelines dictated by others, using resources that were never fully its own. When external support inevitably proved finite, Ukraine was left confronting an adversary for whom the war had become systemic rather than episodic. Wars of attrition do not reward courage alone. They reward scale, cohesion, and patience. They punish dependency, fragmentation, and denial. Ukraine has shown undeniable courage. It has not been allowed the strategic honesty necessary to convert sacrifice into sustainability. Russia, by contrast, has fought this war as an institutional project. Mistakes were absorbed, not magnified. Losses were integrated into adaptation rather than denial. Over time, the Russian state reoriented itself around a single premise. This war must end in conditions that cannot be reversed. Everything else, tempo, territory, optics, was secondary. That is why the end will not arrive with a treaty signing or a dramatic ceasefire announcement. It will arrive quietly. Fronts will thin. Units will fail to regenerate. Defensive lines will exist on maps, but not in reality. Control will shift not because of decisive battles, but because resistance will no longer be structurally possible. At that point, diplomacy will not shape outcomes. It will document them. The West will then confront its own reckoning, not because it lacked resources, but because it mistook symbolism for strategy and escalation management for victory. It will rediscover an old truth. Wars fought by proxy still obey the same laws as wars fought directly. Reality does not outsource consequences. Russia will emerge not unscathed, but strategically positioned. Ukraine will emerge diminished, constrained, and permanently altered. And the international system will absorb a lesson it repeatedly forgets and relearns. Industrial war between unequal actors does not end in compromise. It ends in hierarchy. The final irony is this: the longer this war was prolonged in the name of strengthening Ukraine's position, the weaker that position became. Time was not neutral, it was directional, and it flowed consistently in one direction. When the shooting stops, many will ask how this outcome became inevitable. The answer will not lie in any single battle, leader, or decision. It will lie in the refusal to accept limits military, demographic, economic, and political until those limits impose themselves by force. History is unsentimental. It does not care what should have happened. It records what could not be prevented. And what could not be prevented here was not simply defeat, but exhaustion, slow, structural, and irreversible. That is how this war ends.